Tatiana's voice cut through the clatter of crystal stemware as she swept past with a tray of untouched appetizers balanced on one palm. Table 7 wants another bottle of the Chateau Margaux. And your favorite enigma is here again. Same booth, same request for you specifically. I looked up from polishing wine glasses, that now familiar tension coiling in my chest whenever Marcellus Du Martel graced the Crimson Rose with his presence. 5 months he'd been coming here, always after midnight, always alone, always ordering wines he never drank while watching the room with eyes that seemed to catalogue every breath, every heartbeat, every whispered conversation. He leaves ridiculous tips, Tatiana continued, her Georgian accent thickening with amusement as she leaned against the bar. And those cheekbones could cut glass. What's your hesitation, Katya? Before we dive in, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button if you are new here. Smash the like button if you're already hooked and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. I love getting to know each of you. Also stay tuned because tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get back to the story. The hesitation was that everything about Marcellus Du Martel triggered instincts I'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Not ordinary danger. I'd been trained to navigate that in Moscow. This was something else entirely. Something that made my old SVR intelligence training activate like muscle memory, analyzing threat patterns in the elegant way he moved, the archaic formality of his speech, the unsettling stillness of someone who didn't need to breathe between sentences. No hesitation, I lied, smoothing my hands down my black uniform and checking my reflection in the polished copper of the espresso machine. My blonde hair remained secured in its professional chignon despite the late-hour rush. A few strategic strands framing features I'd learned to make forgettable, essential when you'd fled halfway across the world with a new name and forged documents. At 28, I'd perfected the art of service industry invisibility, competent enough to earn decent tips, unmemorable enough that no one asked uncomfortable questions about my past. The Crimson Rose hummed with its peculiar after-midnight energy. New Orleans' French Quarter attracted a specific clientele once the sun set. Wealthy night owls conducting business over Bordeaux, artists seeking inspiration in absinthe and atmosphere, tourists chasing the gothic romance of wrought iron balconies and gas lamps casting shadows that seemed almost alive. I'd become fluent in reading the social choreography, identifying the power dynamics and unspoken tensions that played out beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal and candlelight that never quite reached the corners. But tonight felt different. Wrong in ways my training refused to let me ignore. I'd first noticed it around 12:45 when a woman in vintage couture had claimed table 9. Nothing immediately alarming. The Crimson Rose attracted eccentrics who dressed like they'd stepped from another century. But this particular patron had ordered champagne an hour ago and hadn't touched the glass. Instead, she sat with predatory stillness, spine straight, head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to conversations 3 tables away. Impossible unless. More concerning was her positioning. Table 9 offered direct sight lines to booth 7, Marcellus's usual location. Every few minutes, her gaze would drift in that direction. Not obviously, but with the focused awareness of professional surveillance. The kind I'd conducted dozens of times during my years with Russian intelligence. Then there was the man at the bar. Early 30s, expensive tailoring that whispered old European money, nursing cognac he'd ordered 40 minutes ago without taking more than a performative sip. He'd positioned himself with clear views of both the main entrance and the service corridor leading to the kitchen, his shoulders carrying tension that didn't match someone supposedly unwinding after a long night. The way he kept adjusting his jacket suggested he was armed, though I couldn't identify the weapon type from this distance. A third figure had materialized near the restrooms 15 minutes ago. A younger man, maybe late 20s, with the coiled energy of someone operating on adrenaline and a precise timeline. He'd claimed the small corner table that most patrons avoided, the one offering perfect surveillance of the back exit. The route that staff used. The route I'd watched Marcellus use every night when he left just before dawn. A fourth operative, because that's what they were, operatives, not casual diners, stood in the shadow near the vintage photographs lining the hallway to the wine cellar. A woman with severe features and movements so economical they barely displaced the air around her. Professional. Dangerous. Positioned to block that potential escape route. My psychology training from Moscow had taught me to recognize behavioral patterns most people missed. And these four individuals exhibited textbook pre-action coordination, synchronized timing despite appearing to ignore each other, strategic positioning covering all exits, the hypervigilant stillness of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But there was something else. Something that set off alarms beyond standard intelligence analysis. The way they moved wasn't quite right. Too smooth. Too still between gestures. The woman at table 9 had been sitting in the same position for 45 minutes without shifting her weight or crossing her legs. A physical impossibility for normal humans experiencing muscle fatigue. The man at the bar hadn't blinked in the 3 minutes I'd been watching him. And the younger operative near the restrooms cast a shadow that seemed to bend at wrong angles, as if the darkness itself was pulling toward him rather than away from the candlelight. Earth to Katerina. Tatiana's voice snapped me back to the present. Your mysterious patron is waiting. And you know how he gets when service is delayed, all polite disappointment that somehow feels more dangerous than anger. I grabbed the bottle of Chateau Margaux that Marcellus always ordered. A vintage from 1787 that shouldn't even exist anymore, let alone be available in a New Orleans supper club, yet somehow appeared in our cellar specifically for his visits. My hands remained steady through years of practice, even as my pulse accelerated with the certainty that something catastrophic was about to unfold. I'd survived Moscow by trusting my instincts, by recognizing patterns of violence before they materialized into action, by understanding that sometimes the most dangerous threats announce themselves through absence rather than presence. The conversations that stopped when certain people entered rooms, the careful way trained killers controlled their breathing, the synchronized timing that spoke of military coordination. Tonight, all those patterns were screaming at me in a language I'd hoped never to hear again. I approached booth 7, where Marcellus sat with his usual aristocratic composure, dressed in clothing that looked simultaneously contemporary and archaic, perfectly tailored but with details that suggested another era. High collar. Ornate embroidery on the cuffs. Fabric that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. His pale features could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and austere beauty, with storm-gray eyes that tracked my approach with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Good evening, Mr. Du Martel," I said, proud that my voice betrayed none of the adrenaline flooding my system. "Your usual vintage?" "Katerina." The way he said my name with that faint accent I'd never been able to place. French certainly, but older than modern French with pronunciations that belonged in historical linguistics textbooks, sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "You seem distracted tonight. Something troubling you?" Before I could answer, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The woman at table 9 had shifted her position for the first time, her attention now locked entirely on Marcellus. The man at the bar set down his cognac with deliberate precision. The younger operative near the restrooms checked his watch with the focused intensity of someone operating on a countdown. 23:47. 13 minutes until something. Until what? That's when I heard it. A fragment of conversation as I passed close enough to the woman at table 9. She was speaking into her phone, voice barely above a whisper, but my training had taught me to pick out meaningful sounds in chaotic environments. L'Ancien doit mourir avant l'aube. Old French. The ancient must die before dawn. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a robbery. Wasn't a standard organized crime hit. This was something else entirely. The archaic language. The timing synchronized with dawn's approach. The way these operatives moved with that predatory stillness that seemed almost inhuman. I glanced at my watch. 23:48. 12 minutes until midnight. Maybe 4 hours until dawn. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. For operatives positioned at compass points around the dining room, all maintaining visual contact with booth 7, all operating on the same precise timeline, all focused on Marcellus Du Martel's usual departure routine. His habit of leaving just before the first hint of sunrise, always through the service corridor, always alone. This was an assassination attempt, but not a human one. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the wine bottle. Every rational instinct screamed at me to mind my own business, to finish my shift, to collect my tips and return to my studio apartment, where the most dangerous thing I faced was the ever-growing stack of unpaid bills and the constant fear that someone from my past would finally track me down. But I couldn't shake the image of Marcellus walking unsuspecting into whatever trap these operatives had prepared. Couldn't ignore the fact that I might be the only person in this room who'd recognized the coordination pattern. The only one trained to see what everyone else missed. Maybe I was wrong. God knows 3 years of running had made me see threats in innocent coincidences. But what if I wasn't? What if these 12 minutes were all that stood between this enigmatic man and whatever waited for him in the darkness beyond the Crimson Rose's candlelit sanctuary? I leaned forward as I poured his wine, close enough to catch that strange scent that always surrounded him, aged parchment and something metallic and cold stone warmed by centuries of touch. Close enough to whisper without being overheard. "Mr. Du Martel," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fear. "I might be completely wrong, but I think you should stay very still and don't talk. Something's planned for when you leave tonight. For operatives. Coordinated positioning. They're waiting for you to move toward the exit." His hand stilled on the crystal goblet. Those storm-gray eyes locked onto mine with sudden predatory focus, and in that instant I saw something flicker in their depths. Something ancient. Something that confirmed every impossible suspicion forming in my mind. For a heartbeat, we existed in a bubble of shared tension while the Crimson Rose continued its oblivious hum around us. While 4 assassins waited in the shadows. While 12 minutes stood between now and catastrophe. "Explain," he said, his voice so low I almost missed it. But the command in that single word was absolute. And just like that I'd made my choice. The choice that would cost me everything I'd spent 3 years building. My anonymity, my safety, my carefully constructed new life. The choice that would pull me into a world where the darkness itself had teeth. The words tumbled out in a rush of Russian-accented French, each syllable weighted with the certainty that I was either saving a life or destroying my own. Cadre operateurs. Positions aux points cardinaux. Ascendant que vous vous dirigez vers la sortie. Marcellus's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the crystal goblet, the only outward sign he'd heard me. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had always seemed to see too much, shifted from casual observation to absolute focus in the space between heartbeats. And in the candlelight I saw something I'd somehow missed during 5 months of serving him wine he never drank. His irises reflected the flame like a cat's, like a predator's, like something that had no business existing outside of folklore and fever dreams. "Combien de temps? How long?" His voice remained conversational, but I caught the edge beneath it now, sharp as a blade drawn in darkness. "Minutes. Maybe less. They're synchronized for..." I didn't get to finish. The woman at table 9 moved first, rising from her seat with fluid grace that defied physics. One moment she was seated. The next she was airborne, crossing 15 feet of dining room in a blur of vintage silk and inhuman speed. Her target, Marcellus's throat. But Marcellus was faster. He'd moved before my eyes could track the motion, the wine bottle shattering against the booth's mahogany paneling as he intercepted her mid-leap. The impact should have broken bones. Instead they collided with a sound like thunder contained in flesh, and suddenly the elegant supper club transformed into something from a nightmare. The man at the bar abandoned all pretense, producing a wooden stake from inside his jacket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He vaulted over the bar with impossible athleticism, moving so fast he left afterimages in the candlelight. The younger operative near the restrooms came from the opposite direction, and I realized with sick certainty that I was watching coordinated military tactics executed by things that shouldn't exist. Around us the other patrons screamed. Tables overturned. Crystal shattered. But I stood frozen in the center of the chaos, watching Marcellus fight 3 assailants simultaneously with brutal economical precision. There was nothing romantic about it, nothing elegant. This was apex predators attempting to kill each other with single-minded efficiency. Marcellus caught the stake aimed at his chest, snapping the man's wrist backward at an angle that made my stomach lurch. The attacker didn't scream, just hissed with fury and pain, revealing elongated canines that confirmed what my rational mind was still trying to deny. Vampires. They were all vampires. The woman from table 9 recovered impossibly fast, launching herself at Marcellus again with clawed hands aimed at his eyes. He caught her by the throat mid-strike and slammed her into the nearest wall with enough force to crack the plaster. She crumpled, stunned but alive, or whatever passed for alive among the undead. The younger operative proved more cautious, circling for an opening that never came. Marcellus moved like violence given form, each strike calculated to incapacitate rather than kill. Within 90 seconds that felt like hours, two attackers lay subdued on the crimson-stained floor. The man with the broken wrist and the woman from table 9, both restrained by some means I couldn't identify, their bodies rigid as if frozen by invisible bonds. But the younger operative and the fourth assassin, the woman who'd been watching from the shadows, had vanished into the New Orleans night through the service corridor, moving faster than human eyes could follow. The dining room had emptied except for me and the carnage. Tatiana had fled with the other staff. The patrons had scattered. And I stood there with my back pressed against the bar, pulse hammering, watching Marcellus straighten his jacket as if he hadn't just engaged in supernatural combat. "You should have run." His voice carried no accusation, just statement of fact. Blood, darker than it should be, stained his pristine white collar. Not his blood, I realized. "Why didn't you run?" Before I could answer, the front doors opened. 3 figures entered with the same predatory grace Marcellus possessed, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of centuries working together. A woman with French Creole features and eyes like amber. A black man whose bearing suggested military background even before death. A third whose face I couldn't quite focus on, as if my brain refused to process something about his appearance. They assessed the scene with professional efficiency, producing what looked like body bags from seemingly nowhere. The 2 subdued vampires were secured with swift, practiced movements. One of the newcomers, the woman with amber eyes, began speaking rapidly in French too old for me to fully comprehend, coordinating cleanup with someone on her phone. I edged toward the service corridor, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention. This was my chance. Get out before questions I couldn't answer, before they realized I'd seen too much before. "Miss Moldov." Marcellus's hand closed gently around my wrist. Not restraining but unmistakably preventing my departure. His skin was cold, far colder than human skin should be. "I don't believe we've finished our conversation." "I didn't see anything." The lie sounded pathetic even to my ears. "I don't know what." "You warned me in 3 languages." His smile held no warmth. Russian accented French, delivered with tactical precision. "You identified coordinated surveillance patterns that my own people missed. And you're currently calculating exit strategies while simultaneously assessing which of my associates poses the greatest threat to your escape." His head tilted slightly, studying me like a specimen under glass. "You have an interesting skill set for a waitress, miss." I considered lying. Considered giving him one of the half-dozen false identities I'd developed during my years running from Moscow. But those storm-gray eyes saw too much, and I was too exhausted from 3 years of deception to maintain another fiction. "Moldov. Katerina Moldov." "Katerina." He tested the name, the Russian pronunciation perfect. "I think, Miss Moldov, that we have much to discuss. And I'm afraid your safety is no longer guaranteed. The 2 who escaped will report to whoever orchestrated this betrayal. They now know that I had assistance. That a human woman with unusual observational skills helped me survive their ambush." He paused, letting the implications settle. "They will want to know what else you've seen. What else you might know. Who you really are." As if summoned by his words, a black car pulled up outside. A vintage Rolls-Royce that belonged in a museum, gleaming under the gas lamps. The woman with amber eyes held the door open, waiting. "I can protect you," Marcellus continued, his tone suggesting this was simply pragmatic necessity rather than kindness. "Or you can take your chances alone, knowing that things considerably more dangerous than me are now aware of your existence." It wasn't really a choice. We both knew that. I could run, I'd gotten good at running, but I'd be running from creatures that moved faster than human reflexes could track, that had centuries of experience hunting people like me. Or I could step into that car and into a world that defied everything I'd learned to believe during my training with the SVR. I looked at the chaos of the dining room, at the blood drying on antique floors, at the impossibility of what I'd just witnessed. Then at Marcellus, this enigmatic figure who'd spent 5 months coming to the Crimson Rose for reasons I finally understood had nothing to do with the wine. "If I come with you," I said carefully, "I want answers. Then we understand each other." He gestured toward the waiting car. "After you, Miss Moldov." I walked toward the Rolls-Royce on legs that felt disconnected from my body, acutely aware that I was leaving behind everything familiar. The carefully constructed anonymity, the illusion of safety, the pretense that I could outrun my past forever. The interior smelled of leather and age and that same metallic scent that clung to Marcellus. As we pulled away from the crimson rose, I caught my reflection in the tinted window. Still looked like myself. Still looked human. But something fundamental had shifted in the woman staring back at me. I'd spent 3 years hiding from Russian intelligence services, from my brother's betrayal, from the violence that had defined my previous life. I'd never imagined I'd end up hiding with vampires instead. The compound occupied a converted mansion in the French Quarter's oldest section, where buildings predated American ownership and remembered when this city answered to French and Spanish crowns. Gothic revival architecture merged with earlier colonial bones, creating something that belonged simultaneously to multiple centuries. Wrought iron galleries wrapped around the structure like intricate lacework, and the interior courtyard concealed a fountain that had been flowing since before the Louisiana Purchase. I'd been here 3 weeks and I still discovered new rooms daily. The archives are off-limits, Isabeau Devereaux informed me during my first formal tour, her French Creole accent carrying the linguistic patterns of someone who'd learned the language when Versailles still housed royalty. She moved through the halls with liquid grace, for centuries of existence translating into movements so refined they appeared choreographed. Her beauty was the dangerous kind, high cheekbones, skin like polished mahogany, eyes the color of aged amber that missed nothing. As is the East Wing after midnight. That's when the younger ones feed, and witnessing the process can be unsettling for humans. Noted, I said, cataloging the information while simultaneously mapping exit routes and security blind spots. Old habits from Moscow died hard. She paused at a portrait gallery, gesturing to paintings that depicted Marcellus through various eras. Same face, different clothing, different backgrounds. Revolutionary France. Antebellum New Orleans. Roaring 20s. He doesn't discuss his turning often. But you should know he was mortal once. Remembers being mortal. That memory shapes every decision he makes. Over the following days, I was introduced to Marcellus's inner circle with the careful formality of someone being vetted for security clearance. Nathaniel Cross managed the blood supply networks, a former surgeon whose Civil War experience translated into meticulous organizational systems. He'd been turned on the battlefield at Antietam, dying of wounds that should have killed him, offered immortality by a vampire who needed medical expertise more than another soldier. His records were immaculate. Dates, quantities, donor names, distribution schedules for the network of consensual providers who supplied the vampire population. We're not monsters, he explained during one of our early meetings, his southern accent softened by 160 years but still present. The ancient laws exist for a reason. Consensual donors, fair compensation, medical monitoring. It's civilization versus savagery. Then there was Lucien Thibault, Marcellus's second-in-command for over 2 centuries. If Isabeau was the strategic mind and Nathaniel the logistical backbone, Lucien was the charismatic face, the diplomat who negotiated with other vampire territories, who smoothed conflicts before they escalated into violence. French-born, Renaissance-era turned, with the kind of effortless charm that made people trust him instinctively. Katerina. He greeted me warmly during our first introduction, kissing both my cheeks in the European manner. The woman who saved our king. We are in your debt. My intelligence training activated automatically, cataloging microexpressions and behavioral tells. Isabeau's amber eyes tracked me with analytical precision, assessing threat level and utility. Nathaniel's medical background manifested in the way he studied my pulse points, calculating heartbeat and health with clinical detachment. But Lucien's charm felt rehearsed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, the way he positioned himself always maintaining clear sight lines to exits and to Marcellus. I filed the observations away, building dossiers in my mind the way I'd been trained in Moscow. The late-night conversations with Marcellus began accidentally. I'd been unable to sleep. The compound's nocturnal schedule inverted my circadian rhythms, and found him in the library at 3 a.m, surrounded by books in languages I couldn't identify. Latin. Old French. Something that might have been Aramaic. Can't sleep? He asked without looking up, somehow aware of my presence despite my attempts at stealth. Different schedule than I'm used to. I settled into the chair across from him, noting the leather-bound journal he'd been writing in. What are you working on? Correspondence. When you've lived 8 centuries, You accumulate obligations that require regular attention. He set down his pen, studying me with that unsettling intensity. Tell me, Katerina, what does a waitress from Russia know about coordinated surveillance patterns? There was the question he'd been too polite to ask directly until now. I read a lot of crime novels, I offered, knowing the lie sounded pathetic. His smile held no humor. In 3 languages with tactical terminology that suggests military training. He leaned back, candlelight casting shadows across features that belonged on Renaissance sculptures. I won't press. Everyone here has secrets they'd prefer remain buried. But understand, I'm trusting you with information about my court, my people, the conspiracy that nearly killed me. That trust is not given lightly. Over subsequent nights, our conversations deepened beyond strategic necessity. He spoke of being mortal in 13th century France, of watching his family die from plague, of the vampire who'd offered him eternity as alternative to joining them in death. 800 years of memory, of watching empires rise and collapse, of outliving everyone he'd ever loved in his mortal life. Do you regret it? I asked one night, emboldened by darkness and the strange intimacy of shared insomnia. Accepting immortality? Every day. His voice carried weight that centuries had accumulated. And never. I've witnessed humanity's worst atrocities and greatest achievements. I've held power that could destroy lives with a word. I've made decisions that haunt me across centuries. He met my eyes. But I've also protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Built systems that prevent the kind of predation that vampires are capable of. That has to mean something. I understood then what drew me to him beyond physical attraction or the dangerous novelty of his world. He carried responsibility the way I'd carried my SVR mission, as burden and purpose intertwined, unable to separate one from the other. But the immortality barrier remained. He would exist unchanged while I aged and died, a brief flicker in his eternal existence. The tragedy of that impossible equation haunted our every interaction. My 3rd week in the compound, I began auditing Nathaniel's blood supply records. Ostensibly to understand the system, actually to apply my intelligence analysis training. The discrepancies jumped out immediately once I started looking for patterns. Small amounts disappeared regularly, quantities that wouldn't trigger alarm unless someone tracked cumulative loss over months. 5 units here, 3 there, always from different suppliers, always documented as spillage or contamination. This doesn't make sense, I told Marcellus, spreading the manifests across his desk. The losses are too consistent to be random, too irregular to be systematic theft. Someone's diverting blood deliberately while making it look like operational waste. His expression darkened as he reviewed my analysis. Rogue vampires. Ones who refuse to follow ancient laws, who prefer hunting to consensual feeding. Or someone stockpiling resources for something larger. My SVR training kicked in, building threat assessments. An insurgency needs supplies. If the coup attempt at the Crimson Rose was just the opening move. I didn't finish the thought because something in the shipping manifest had caught my attention. A symbol I recognized from my previous life, stamped faintly on customs documentation. 3 interlocking wolves, the mark of the Volkov Bratva. My blood turned to ice. The Volkov Bratva had expanded from Moscow to New Orleans, trafficking humans under the guise of labor recruitment. Which meant Dmitri might be here. Might be part of whatever conspiracy had nearly killed Marcellus. Might discover that his sister wasn't dead as he believed, but alive and hiding in plain sight in the French Quarter. Katerina. Marcellus's voice seemed distant. You look like you've seen a ghost. I need to go back to my apartment, I said, already calculating extraction routes. There are things there I should have retrieved earlier. Documents, identification. I'll send someone with you. No. The word came out too sharp. I mean, it's better if I go alone. Less conspicuous. His eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Take Isabeau's car. And Katerina? Be careful. The apartment I'd rented near Tulane University looked exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks earlier. Small, anonymous, containing nothing that couldn't be abandoned at a moment's notice. I'd learned in Moscow never to own anything I wasn't willing to lose. I was stuffing documents into a backpack when I heard the lock click. 3 men entered with the professional silence of people trained for abduction rather than murder. Bratva soldiers I identified immediately, expensive but practical clothing, the particular way they moved that spoke of systema training, the quiet coordination that came from working together on dozens of operations. They wanted me alive. That gave me an advantage. The first one moved to cut off my exit and I used his forward momentum against him, redirecting his mass with precise systema technique and sending him crashing into the kitchenette. The second came from my left, faster than expected, but I'd trained against inhuman speed for weeks now. I dropped below his grab, swept his leg and disabled his knee with a strike that would require months of recovery. The third proved more challenging. He'd been holding back, assessing my capabilities, and now came at me with the serious intent of someone who recognized trained opposition. We exchanged strikes too fast for civilian eyes to track, each of us reading the other's systema conditioning, understanding we'd likely trained under similar instructors in the same Moscow facilities. "Katerina Moldov," he said in Russian, confirming my worst fears. "Your brother sends his regards." I had my answer about Dmitri's location, but the distraction cost me. His partner, the one I'd knee-struck, had recovered enough to grab me from behind. Human strength versus human strength, I was outmatched by body weight and leverage. Then the door exploded inward, and Marcellus entered like vengeance given form. The transformation from elegant aristocrat to apex predator happened faster than thought. Within seconds, 2 Bratva soldiers were unconscious, and the third was pressed against the wall with Marcellus's hand around his throat. "Who sent you?" Marcellus's voice carried command that transcended language. But the soldier's eyes had moved to me, recognition dawning. "You're supposed to be dead," Dmitri said. Marcellus increased pressure, cutting off speech. But the damage was done. The questions in his storm-gray eyes as he looked at me were unmistakable. Who was I really? And what had I been hiding since the moment I'd whispered that warning in the Crimson Rose? The drive back to the compound happened in suffocating silence. Marcellus had secured the 3 Bratva soldiers with efficiency that suggested he'd done this countless times before, arranging for their transport and interrogation. But his questions, the ones that mattered, remained unasked until we were alone in his study, the door closed against curious ears. "Dmitri," he said finally, pouring himself a glass of blood wine that I'd learned was the vampire equivalent of unwinding after stressful events. "Your brother, presumably. The one who believes you're dead." There was no point in lying anymore. The carefully constructed fiction of Katerina Moldov, anonymous waitress fleeing generic troubles, had shattered the moment that soldier recognized me. "Dmitri Moldov," I confirmed, accepting the whiskey he poured for me with hands that trembled slightly. "My partner for 5 years with the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. We specialized in counter-trafficking operations, targeting organizations like the Volkov Bratva that moved humans like commodities across borders." Marcellus settled into the chair across from me, his expression unreadable. "Continue." The story came out in fragments, pieces of a past I'd tried to bury beneath layers of assumed identity. How Dmitri and I had been recruited young, trained together, trusted each other with our lives during operations that left bodies in Moscow alleys and trafficking routes disrupted. How I'd started noticing discrepancies in his reports, small inconsistencies that my analytical mind couldn't ignore. How I'd followed him one night and discovered he'd been compromised for over a year, feeding information to the Volkov Bratva, taking payments to ensure certain shipments passed through our surveillance without interference. I tried to report him through proper channels, I said, the whiskey burning my throat. But he'd anticipated that possibility. He'd already framed me, planted evidence suggesting I was the compromised one, that I'd been taking Bratva money, that my reports had been fabricated to protect my own criminal enterprise. I met Marcellus's storm-gray eyes. I had maybe 12 hours before they came for me. So I ran. Forged documents, new identity, passage to the United States on a cargo ship that asked no questions. I've been Katerina the waitress for 3 years, trying to convince myself I could disappear completely. "But you can't disappear from family," Marcellus said quietly, something ancient and weary in his voice. "Believe me, I understand that particular impossibility. I should have told you." The admission tasted like failure. The moment I saw the Bratva symbols, I should have. "Yes, you should have." His tone carried disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "I've trusted you with information about my court, my people, the conspiracy threatening everything I've built over centuries. That trust was predicated on honesty." "I know," Silence stretched between us, weighted with everything unsaid. I'd spent 3 years learning to live with deception, convincing myself that omission wasn't the same as lying. But sitting across from someone who valued truth above almost everything else, I felt the full weight of my choices. Your skills, Marcellus said finally, are now considerably more relevant than I realized. Military intelligence training, experience infiltrating criminal organizations, familiarity with the Volkov-Bratva's operational structure. Something shifted in his expression, calculation replacing disappointment. You might be the only person capable of infiltrating the human side of this conspiracy. You want to use me as an asset. Not a question. I want to stop whoever's attempting to destroy the systems that keep vampires from becoming the monsters humans fear. He leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. If that requires using your expertise, yes. But understand, Katerina, the trust between us has been damaged. I will work with you because circumstances demand it. But I will also guard against further deception. The professional distance in his voice hurt more than I'd expected. We'd been building something fragile and precious during those late-night conversations, something that transcended the strategic alliance. Now I watched it calcify into purely tactical cooperation. I understand, I said, because what else could I say? Marcellus convened his inner circle the following evening. Isabeau, Nathaniel, and Lucien gathering in the formal receiving room that probably hosted such meetings for 2 centuries. I presented my analysis with the clinical precision I'd learned at SVR, mapping out the conspiracy's structure on a physical board like I was briefing Russian intelligence officers. The blood diversion through Nathaniel's supply chain provides resources, I explained, connecting nodes with red thread. The Volkov-Bratva provides human trafficking victims for unregulated feeding, vampires who reject the ancient law's requirement for consensual donors. And somewhere, someone's recruiting vampire soldiers with promises of freedom from those same laws. A revolution, Isabeau said softly, her amber eyes tracking the connections. Young vampires who see the ancient laws as oppressive, who want to rule openly rather than hide in shadows. Led by someone with intimate knowledge of this court's operations, I continued. Someone who knows Marcellus's routines, who has access to blood supply records, who can coordinate timing for an assassination attempt. I paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Someone in this room or close enough to it that the distinction doesn't matter. Lucien laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. You suspect one of us? Katerina, we've served Marcellus for centuries. Isabeau was with him when he first claimed New Orleans. Nathaniel has managed blood supplies since before your country existed. And he spread his hands in an elegant gesture. I've been his right hand for 200 years. If any of us wanted him dead, we've had countless opportunities. Which makes you all either absolutely loyal or absolutely patient, I countered, watching his micro-expressions. The slight tightening around his eyes. The way his smile held a fraction too long. The excessive detail in his defense. A classic tell of deception. Paranoia is an occupational hazard of intelligence work, Lucien said smoothly. But I assure you your suspicions are misplaced. I filed away his response, cataloging it alongside 3 weeks of behavioral observations. Couldn't prove anything yet. But my instincts, the ones that had kept me alive in Moscow, screamed that Marcellus's most trusted lieutenant was performing loyalty rather than embodying it. Nathaniel provided additional supply records. Isabeau offered to investigate vampire recruitment patterns in other territories. Lucien volunteered to reach out to contacts in the human criminal underworld. All perfectly helpful. All exactly what innocent parties would do. The meeting dispersed near dawn, everyone retreating to their daylight sanctuaries. But I found Marcellus still in his study hours later, staring at the conspiracy map with an expression that carried the weight of centuries. Can't sleep? I asked from the doorway, echoing our first late-night conversation. Wondering which of my oldest friends is trying to kill me. He didn't turn around. Or if your Russian paranoia is seeing patterns that don't exist. It's not paranoia if they're actually trying to kill you. I moved into the room, maintaining careful distance. And my instincts have kept me alive this long. Your instincts also told you to lie to me for 3 weeks. The accusation hung between us, deserved and cutting. I'm sorry, I said quietly. For what little that's worth. He turned then, and something in his expression made my breath catch. Not anger anymore, but something more dangerous. Vulnerability. Have you ever considered it? He asked, the question seemingly unrelated. Becoming like us. Trading mortality for immortality. The shift in topic disoriented me. What? You've been living among vampires for weeks now. Witnessed what we're capable of. Understood that the legends are both less and more than humans imagine. He moved closer, and I held my ground despite every instinct screaming about predators and proximity. Has the thought crossed your mind? Yes, I admitted, because we'd already established that lies between us caused more damage than truth. But I'm terrified of losing my humanity. Of becoming the kind of monster I spent 5 years fighting in Moscow. Power without conscience is what made the Bratva possible, what makes trafficking victims into commodities. And you think vampirism would strip away your conscience? I think eternity might make human suffering seem insignificant. How much can individual lives matter when you've watched thousands of generations pass? Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. I've lived 800 years, he said softly, close enough now that I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. 8 centuries watching humans live and die, empires rise and collapse. Everything I build eventually turned to dust. And in all that time I've never felt what I feel when you walk into a room. My heart hammered against my ribs. Marcellus. The knowledge that you'll age and die while I remain unchanged is a torture I haven't experienced since my mortal family died of plague in 1247. His hand came up, fingers ghosting along my jaw with exquisite gentleness. I'd forgotten what it feels like to fear losing someone. To understand that time itself is the enemy. This can't work, I whispered even as I leaned into his touch. The logistics alone. I know. His forehead rested against mine, and I felt him shudder with something that might have been a breath he didn't need. But that doesn't change what I feel. When he kissed me, it was tender and desperate and tinged with the tragedy of impossible timing. His lips were cold against mine, but the emotion behind the gesture burned. This was someone who'd lived centuries learning to control every impulse, finally allowing himself to feel something raw and unguarded. And I kissed him back, knowing we were building something beautiful and doomed, unable to stop ourselves despite the obvious futility. We broke apart breathless. While I was breathless, he was just carefully still, and the weight of reality settled back over us like a shroud. We should get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow we start infiltrating the conspiracy. I nodded, turning toward the door before the moment could crack under its own emotional weight. But I paused at the threshold, looking back at him silhouetted against the conspiracy map. For what it's worth, I said quietly, these 3 weeks with you have felt more real than 3 years of hiding. His smile carried 8 centuries of accumulated sadness. That's worth more than you know. I found the message the next evening, slipped under my door with professional precision that suggested someone had bypassed the compound's considerable security. A photograph of Marcellus and me in the courtyard, taken from an angle that required telephoto lens and elevated position. And beneath it, a note in Russian that made my blood turn to ice. Little sister, you can't hide in the shadows forever. We should talk about old times. Dmitri knew where I was. Knew I'd survived. Knew I was involved with the vampire king he was apparently conspiring to destroy. And he wanted to talk. The photograph lay on Marcellus's desk like evidence at a crime scene, which in a sense it was. Evidence that the compound's security had been breached. Evidence that Dmitri had resources sophisticated enough to surveil a vampire king's residence. Evidence that my past had finally caught up with me in the worst possible way. He wants a meeting, I said, studying the Cyrillic script with the detached analysis I'd learned at SVR. Not an immediate attack. He's leaving room for negotiation. Or he's setting a trap. Marcellus stood at the window, watching the French Quarter settle into its nocturnal rhythms. Using your shared history as leverage to get you alone. Probably both. I pulled out my phone, typing a response in Russian before I could second-guess the decision. Tomorrow night. Café Amélie, Garden District. Come alone or don't come at all. But he's also our best source of intelligence on the human side of the conspiracy. We need to know who's funding this operation, what resources they've accessed, how deep the Bratva's involvement goes. Isabeau materialized in the doorway with her characteristic silent grace. You're considering using yourself as bait. I'm considering gathering intelligence from a high-value asset who happens to be my brother. I met her amber eyes. There's a difference. A distinction without meaning if you end up dead or compromised. She moved into the room, studying the photograph with professional assessment. He's had eyes on this compound for at least days, maybe weeks. That's a significant surveillance operation. Over the next 18 hours, we developed the tactical plan with the kind of meticulous detail that came from centuries of vampire experience merged with my SVR training. I'd wear a wire, modified to account for vampiric hearing sensitivity, and meet Dimitri at Café Amélie, a late-night establishment in the Garden District with enough civilian presence to discourage immediate violence. Marcellus's people would position themselves within strike range but far enough away not to trigger Dimitri's counter-surveillance instincts. If he tries to take you, Marcellus said quietly as we reviewed the extraction protocols, don't fight. Let my people handle it. If he tries to take me, I'll break his arm in 3 places before your people arrive. I checked the wire's concealment beneath my clothing. I didn't survive 3 years running by being a passive asset. Something flickered in his expression, concern mixed with reluctant admiration. Just, be careful. Please. The please undid something in my chest. This ancient, powerful creature asking rather than commanding, revealing vulnerability he'd probably spent centuries learning to conceal. I will, I promised, knowing we both understood I was about to walk into a situation where careful might not be enough. Café Amélie occupied a converted courtyard, strings of lights creating intimate pools of illumination among the shadows. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a table with clear sight lines and multiple exit routes. My heart hammered with a rhythm I tried to control through breathing techniques, but 3 years of absence couldn't erase the anxiety of facing the person I'd once trusted more than anyone. Dimitri arrived exactly on time, moving through the cafe with the confidence of someone who owned every space he entered. He'd changed. Harder edges where there'd been humor, ruthlessness where there'd been idealism, the kind of transformation that came from years spent in moral compromise. But his eyes were still the same dark blue we'd inherited from our mother, and the way he smiled when he saw me carried echoes of childhood that made my throat tighten. Katya. The old nickname, the one only he used. He settled into the chair across from me, waving off the waitress with practiced charm. You look good for a dead woman. You look terrible for someone who betrayed everything we believed in. I kept my voice level, conversational, aware that the wire picked up everything. But I suppose working with human traffickers does that to a person. His smile didn't falter. Is that what you think I'm doing? Working with traffickers. He leaned back, studying me with the analytical precision we'd both been trained in. I'm trying to save you, little sister. You've gotten involved with forces you don't understand. I understand vampires exist. I understand some of them are trying to kill Marcellus Du Martel. And I understand you're helping them. I watched his micro-expressions, cataloging tells. What I don't understand is why. Because the ancient laws are a cage. His voice carried genuine conviction, ideological fervor replacing the pragmatic cynicism I'd expected. Vampires are apex predators who've been forced to hide like criminals, to pretend they're not superior to humans in every measurable way. The Volkov-Bratva's alliance with Lucien's faction isn't about trafficking, it's about liberation. Breaking the laws that keep vampires controlled and hidden, allowing them to rule openly. And humans who support that transition will benefit from the new order. By benefit, you mean being allowed to live while others are drained like livestock? I let disgust color my tone. That's not liberation, Dimitri. That's collaboration with monsters. Marcellus has convinced you he's different. Dimitri's expression softened with something that might have been pity. But he's had 8 centuries to perfect the performance of benevolent leadership. The truth is, vampires have manipulated human society since before recorded history. The ancient laws don't protect us, they manage us. Make us compliant food sources who don't realize we're being farmed. You actually believe that? The realization hit with uncomfortable force. This wasn't simple corruption or financial motivation. Dimitri had developed a complete ideological framework justifying his betrayal. You think you're fighting for human agency by helping vampires who want to treat us like prey. I think the current system is a comfortable lie, and Lucien's faction is offering truth. He leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. Come with me, Katia. There's a place for you in what's coming. Safety, wealth, power. Everything we were promised when we joined SVR but never received. All you have to do is provide intelligence about Marcellus's defenses. Help us end this quickly, minimize casualties on both sides. For a moment, I glimpsed the brother I'd loved. Earnest, convinced of his righteousness, genuinely believing he was offering salvation. But I'd seen what his liberation meant. Trafficking victims drained and discarded in the blood supply diversion, humans treated as renewable resources rather than people, the kind of monstrous behavior the ancient laws were specifically designed to prevent. No, I said simply. His expression hardened. You're choosing him over your own brother. Over your own species. I'm choosing the system that treats humans as people deserving consent and compensation over the system that treats us as livestock. I stood, preparing for what came next. And I'm choosing to believe that some vampires are capable of being better than their nature suggests. Dimitri's hand moved in a subtle gesture, signal to hidden operatives. The trap springing exactly as Marcellus and I had anticipated. 3 men materialized from the cafe's shadows, moving with coordination that suggested extensive training. But they moved too fast, inhumanly fast, and I realized with shock that they weren't entirely human anymore. Enhanced somehow, possessing strength and speed that exceeded normal human parameters without fully crossing into vampire territory. I'd expected this possibility. Didn't make it less terrifying when Dimitri himself moved with that same enhanced speed, covering the distance between us faster than should have been possible. I redirected his momentum using Systema principles, but he recovered instantly, striking with force that would have shattered bones if I hadn't rolled with the impact. You've been drinking vampire blood, I said, tasting copper from a split lip. That's the enhancement. That's how you're planning to give humans power in your new order. Diluted vampire blood, Dimitri corrected, circling me with predatory focus. Temporary abilities without the weaknesses. No sunlight vulnerability, no blood dependence, just pure enhancement. Lucien's gift to his human allies. Then Marcellus arrived like vengeance incarnate, and suddenly the cafe became a battlefield of supernatural versus enhanced human. Isabeau and Nathaniel materialized from positions I hadn't even known they occupied, engaging Dimitri's operatives with lethal efficiency. But the enhanced humans fought with shocking effectiveness, their diluted vampire abilities making them formidable opponents even for centuries-old vampires. Dimitri tried one final grab for me, but Marcellus intercepted with speed that made the enhanced humans look sluggish. They faced each other for a moment. My brother and the vampire king I'd chosen to protect, and something passed between them that transcended language. She was mine first, Dimitri said in Russian. She chose where she belongs, Marcellus replied in the same language, his accent perfect despite the centuries since he'd been mortal. Then Dimitri was gone, escaping into the New Orleans night with the enhanced speed that made pursuit nearly impossible. His operatives retreated in coordinated fashion, leaving the cafe in chaos but without the capture they'd intended. He got away, I said unnecessarily, checking my injuries. Bruised ribs, split lip, probably a concussion but nothing critical. But we learned what we needed. Marcellus's hand found mine, checking my pulse with clinical efficiency that didn't match the concern in his eyes. Diluted vampire blood creating enhanced humans. That's not just a tactical advantage, it's forbidden knowledge. Ancient laws prohibit sharing vampiric abilities with humans for this exact reason. Back at the compound, I presented my evidence against Lucien with the methodical precision of someone building a case for prosecution. Timeline analysis showing his access and opportunity for every suspicious event. Behavioral tells catalogued over weeks of observation. Historical research revealing he'd nearly been executed 150 years ago for breaking ancient laws before Marcellus had pardoned him. He's had 2 centuries to plan this, I concluded, pinning the final piece of evidence to the conspiracy board. Recruiting young vampires who resent the ancient laws. Building the Bratva Alliance. Developing the blood enhancement protocol. Everything pointing toward a coup that would fundamentally reshape vampire-human relations. Lucien stood in the corner of the room, and for the first time since I'd met him, his charming mask had dropped completely. What remained was something cold and calculating, the predator underneath the diplomat. Impressive analysis, he said, slow applause mocking my presentation. Though you missed the most important detail, I'm not acting alone within this court. The attack came from everywhere simultaneously. Windows exploded inward as rogue vampires poured through, moving with coordinated military precision. Enhanced humans breached the ground floor, their diluted vampire abilities making them shockingly effective against the compound's defenses. And Lucien himself launched at Marcellus with the accumulated fury of 2 centuries of careful planning finally coming to fruition. The battle was brutal and costly. I watched vampires I'd come to know over weeks die permanently, stakes through hearts, decapitations, the kind of violence that ended immortal existence. Nathaniel fell defending the blood archives, his final act destroying records that would have exposed the entire donor network. Isabeau fought with terrifying grace, but even she couldn't be everywhere at once. I fought using every technique Moscow had taught me, but I was hopelessly outmatched. Enhanced humans possessed advantages I couldn't counter. Rogue vampires moved faster than I could track. And still I fought because what else could I do? Marcellus needed every defender, needed every second of delayed assault to coordinate his loyalists' response. Then Lucien cornered Marcellus in the formal receiving room, and I saw the killing blow coming. A stake aimed with precision born of centuries fighting together, knowing every defensive pattern, anticipating every counter. I moved without thinking, throwing myself between them, taking the strike meant for the Vampire King. The pain was extraordinary. Biblical. The stake pierced through muscle and bone and something essential, and I felt my life beginning to drain with shocking speed. Heard Marcellus screaming my name. Felt his hands catching me as I fell. No. His voice broke on the word. No, Katerina, stay with me. Stay. But I was already fading, consciousness slipping away like water through fingers. My last thought before darkness claimed me was absurd regret. I'd never know if we could have made it work, the mortal woman and the immortal king, finding some impossible compromise between our natures. Then nothing. Then everything. I woke to sensations so overwhelming it bordered on agony, every nerve ending amplified, every sense heightened beyond human capacity. And hunger. God, the hunger driving and primal and all-consuming. Easy. Marcellus's voice, closer than should be possible given the chaos still echoing through the compound. You're in transition. Your body is changing. You turned me. The words came out wrong, voice different, senses cataloging information I shouldn't be able to process. You turned me without consent. His expression carried 8 centuries of accumulated grief. I watched you dying and couldn't let you go. Even knowing it breaks the highest ancient law. Even knowing it will cost me everything. His hand found mine and I felt the connection between us differently now. Sire and progeny bound by blood and transformation. I'm sorry, Katerina. I should have let you choose. But I'm not sorry you're alive. Around us, the battle continued. Lucien had escaped in the chaos, retreating to regroup his forces. But for this moment, in the eye of the storm, I held on to the vampire who'd given me immortality and damnation in equal measure. And tried to understand what I'd become. I woke 3 days later to a world that had been remade. Every sound crashed through me like percussion. Heartbeats from rooms away, conversations whispered in languages I shouldn't understand, the rustle of fabric against skin amplified to thunder. Scents became symphonies of information. Aged wood and iron, the lingering copper of violence, and underneath everything the intoxicating pulse of living blood moving through veins. Strength coursed through my body like lightning contained in flesh. I sat up too quickly and the movement blurred, finding myself standing beside the bed before my mind registered the decision to move. My hands, still recognizably mine but somehow different, stronger, gripped the bedpost hard enough to leave impressions in the wood. Easy. Marcellus materialized in the doorway with speed I could now track, my enhanced vision catching details invisible to human eyes. Your senses are overwhelming because you haven't learned to filter yet. It takes time. How much time? My voice sounded wrong, clearer, carrying undertones that resonated differently than human speech. Weeks for basic control. Decades to master what you're capable of. He moved closer and I caught his scent properly for the first time. Ancient stone and parchment, something metallic that I now understood was the remnant of blood consumed, and underneath it all, power that radiated like heat from a forge. But first you need to feed. The hunger will only get worse until you do. The hunger. God, the hunger was everything he'd warned and worse. A driving need that eclipsed thought, that reduced existence to the singular focus of blood, blood, blood. I could hear hearts beating throughout the compound, could smell the life pulsing through bodies, and every instinct screamed to hunt, to feed, to take what this new nature demanded. I can't. The words came out strangled. I can't hurt someone. You won't. His hand found mine, anchor in the storm of sensation. Nathaniel maintained a network of consensual donors before he died defending this compound. People who understand what we are, who choose to provide blood in exchange for compensation and protection. No compulsion, no violation. Just voluntary exchange. The donor was a woman named Colette, mid-30s with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. She settled into the chair Marcellus indicated, extending her wrist with practiced ease. First time feeding a fledgling, she said, her accent carrying generations of New Orleans heritage. Go easy on me, Sherry. Marcellus guided me through it with patient instruction. Where to bite for minimal scarring, how to control the flow, when to stop before taking too much. The blood was revelation and addiction and fulfillment of a need so profound it bordered on spiritual. But more than that, it carried memories. Fragments of Colette's life, emotions and experiences bleeding through the connection, intimate in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I pulled away, she pressed gauze to the wounds with efficient pressure. Not bad for a first-timer. Most fledglings are messier. She had good instruction, Marcellus said quietly, but something in his expression carried weight beyond pride. And now she faces consequences for my decision to give it. The blood court convened 5 days after my transformation, assembled at a historic plantation house outside New Orleans that had hosted vampire gatherings since before the Civil War. Ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss created cathedral shadows, and the mansion itself radiated power accumulated over centuries of supernatural politics. Vampire lords from across North America arrived in formal procession. Octavian Beaumont from the Eastern Territories, appearing as a young man but carrying himself with the authority of 12 centuries. Seraphine Lacroix from the north, regal and precise, her French accent predating the Revolution. Others whose names I struggled to remember, all ancient, all powerful, all here to judge whether Marcellus deserved to remain king. The tribunal convened in the plantation's grand ballroom, and I stood beside Marcellus feeling desperately young and new among beings who'd existed for millennia. Octavian opened the prosecution with the weight of absolute certainty. Marcellus Du Martel stands accused of violating the highest ancient law, turning a human without proper consent. The law exists without exception precisely because our nature makes the power imbalance too extreme for genuine consent. He has admitted to the crime. The only question is whether he faces execution or permanent exile. Context matters. Seraphine's voice cut through the assembly like a blade. The ancient laws exist to protect vampire society. Marcellus's actions were in direct service of that protection, saving a human who'd proven instrumental in exposing a conspiracy that threatened us all. The law doesn't allow for exceptions based on convenience, Octavian countered. If we permit violations when circumstances seem to justify them, we undermine the entire foundation of our society. The debate raged for hours, and I listened to my existence being argued as legal precedent, my humanity and subsequent loss thereof reduced to philosophical abstractions. Until Marcellus rose and requested I be permitted to address the court. I stood before the assembled elders still learning to control the predatory instincts that made me want to flee or fight or both. But my SVR training steadied me, and I presented my case with the analytical precision I'd once used in Moscow briefings. I remember being human, I began, holding eye contact with each elder in turn. I remember what it means to be prey, to understand viscerally that I existed at the mercy of beings stronger and faster and more dangerous than myself. That perspective hasn't vanished with transformation. It's become integrated with the power I now possess. I walked them through the conspiracy's scope. The trafficking networks providing unregulated feeding, the enhanced humans created through diluted vampire blood, Lucian's decades of careful planning to overthrow the ancient laws. He wasn't wrong that the laws needed reform. But his solution, violent liberation treating humans as livestock, would have destroyed the carefully maintained balance that allows vampire society to exist without constant war with humanity. And you believe you have a better solution? Octavian's tone carried skepticism. I believe the ancient laws need thoughtful evolution, not revolution. Acknowledgement that vampire nature includes predatory instincts, but that those instincts can be channeled into protection rather than exploitation. Systems that honor both our power and our retained humanity, because some of us still remember what it means to be mortal. Seraphine leaned forward, interest evident. You're proposing reform from within the existing structure. I'm proposing that beings who remember being human might be valuable resources for ensuring the ancient laws serve their intended purpose, protecting both vampires and the humans we interact with. I met Marcellus's eyes across the chamber. What he did was illegal. I won't contest that. But the result, a vampire who bridges human experience and immortal power, might be exactly what this society needs to prevent future coups by those who see the laws as oppression rather than civilization. The elders were deliberating when the attack came. Dmitri breached the plantation's defenses with remaining enhanced soldiers and rogue vampires, and I realized with sick certainty this was a rescue mission. My brother, still believing he was saving me from supernatural manipulation, had launched an assault on the highest vampire tribunal in North America. Katya. His voice carried across the chaos of the interrupted court. I'm getting you out of here. I don't want to be rescued, I called back, moving to intercept him with speed that still felt impossible despite 5 days of practice. We collided in the courtyard, and the fight was everything I'd feared. Brother against sister, human ideology against vampire reality, family bonds tested by transformation and betrayal. His enhanced abilities made him formidable, but my vampire nature granted advantages he couldn't match. We circled each other, trading strikes that combined systema training with supernatural power, and the fight became as much ideological debate as physical combat. Look at yourself, he said, breathing hard from exertion that shouldn't affect enhanced humans. You've become exactly what we fought against in Moscow, a predator who feeds on the vulnerable. I've become someone with power to protect rather than destroy. I caught his strike, holding him immobile with strength he couldn't break. The difference between us isn't human versus vampire. It's whether we use our abilities to exploit or defend. I could have killed him. Every instinct in my new nature screamed to end the threat permanently. But I thought of Marcellus choosing compassion over expedience, thought of the ancient laws designed to prevent monstrous behavior, thought of who I wanted to be with this terrible gift of immortality. I disabled him with precise strikes that would heal but not permanently damage, then stood over him as Isabel's people secured his restraints. You'll face human justice for your trafficking crimes, I said quietly. Not vampire execution. Because mercy is what separates civilization from savagery. Meanwhile, Marcellus hunted Lucien through the plantation grounds in a battle that spanned centuries of shared history and philosophical divergence. I felt echoes through our sire bond. Not thoughts exactly, but impressions of combat and strategy and the weight of betrayal by someone trusted for 200 years. Using the bond, I sent tactical advice drawn from my analysis of Lucien's patterns. He favors his left side when retreating, overcommits on aggressive strikes, expects you to match his ruthlessness rather than transcend it. The final confrontation took place in the plantation's chapel, and I arrived in time to witness Marcellus stake Lucien through the heart with wood torn from the altar itself. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Judgment delivered in a place of sanctuary, mercy denied to someone who'd rejected every opportunity for redemption. You were like a brother to me, Marcellus said as Lucien's life faded. I would have given you anything except permission to become the monster you accused me of being. Lucien's last words were defiant. The young ones will remember what I offered, freedom from your compassionate cage. Then he was ash and memory, and 2 centuries of loyalty dissolved into betrayal's bitter aftermath. The blood court reconvened in the aftermath, with Dimitri's captured forces and Lucien's permanent death providing context for their judgment. Octavian and Seraphine presented the verdict jointly, a compromise that spoke to hours of deliberation I hadn't witnessed. Marcellus Du Martel violated ancient law, Octavian announced. This court acknowledges circumstances that complicate simple judgment, but the law stands inviolate. His punishment, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and acceptance of oversight for future decisions regarding turning humans. However, Seraphine continued, this court also recognizes that Katerina Moldov represents unprecedented opportunity. A vampire who retains human memory, who bridges mortal experience and immortal power. She is hereby granted the title Blood Consort and formal position to advise on reforming ancient laws to prevent future rebellions by those who mistake civilization for oppression. I stood there processing words that fundamentally altered my existence. Not just vampire but blood consort. Not just survivor but architect of the system that would govern vampire-human relations going forward. Marcellus found me after the court dispersed, and we stood together under ancient oaks watching stars that looked different through vampire eyes. Regrets? He asked quietly. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'd lost my humanity, could never return to mortal existence, would watch human generations pass like seasons while I remained unchanged. But I'd also gained power to protect rather than hide, purpose beyond survival, and centuries ahead to build something that honored both what I'd been and what I'd become. None, I said, meaning it completely. I spent my mortal life running from who I was, both the intelligence operative and the woman capable of caring beyond strategic necessity. Now I can finally be both. His hand found mine, and through our sire bond, I felt the depth of his relief. We'd survived the conspiracy, the blood court, the transformation that should have destroyed us. Now we faced the future together. Two immortal beings who remembered mortality, using that memory to build something better than the absolute control of tradition or the violent freedom of rebellion. The third path. Balanced between predator and protector. Where power served purpose rather than simply existing for its own sake. And immortality stretched ahead like an unwritten book, full of dangerous possibilities and unprecedented hope. Thank you for watching. We hope you sure enjoyed it. Don't forget to click that subscribe button, hit that like button and share this video. Lastly, tell me where you are watching from. Also click on the image on your screen to watch more beautiful, heartwarming stories and stay updated with our latest content.